The road north of Seoul wasn't a road anymore. It was a river of panic flowing south. It was late April 1951. The Korean peninsula was thawing out from a winter that had frozen the oil in truck engines and the blood in men's veins. But the coming spring brought no relief. Instead, it brought the spring offensive. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had unleashed a massive sledgehammer blow designed to shatter the United Nations line, recapture Seoul, and drive the Americans into the sea. And by the looks of the highway, it was working. History would call it a tactical withdrawal. The men on the ground called it the Big Bugout. It was a chaotic, humiliating rout. Thousands of South Korean soldiers, their formations broken and their officers dead, were streaming down the dusty road, eyes wide with the specific kind of terror that comes from being overrun by a human wave. Intermixed with them were American units, their vehicles piled high with equipment, engines groaning as they tried to navigate the sea of refugees and retreating infantry. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and fear. But in the middle of this collapse, there was a strange anomaly. Pushing against the tide of misery, a column of trucks was driving north. They were moving slowly, engines revving hard to force their way through the southbound traffic. The men in the back of these trucks weren't looking at their boots in shame. They were leaning over the tailgates, smoking cigarettes, and watching the retreating army with a mixture of professional disdain and grim fatalism. They wore slouch hats. They carried bolt-action Lee Enfield rifles that looked like they belonged in a museum compared to the semi-automatic Garands of the Americans. They were the men of the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, 3RAR, and they were the only ones heading towards the sound of the guns. To the young American conscripts fleeing the front, these Australians looked like aliens. They were older, harder, and possessed a quiet lethality. Many of the diggers in those trucks were veterans of the Second World War. They had fought the Italians in the scorching sands of North Africa as the rats of Tobruk. They had fought the Japanese in the rotting jungles of the Pacific. They knew what a losing battle looked like, and they knew what panic smelled like. They didn't like it. "Looks like the whole bloody world is running away," one corporal muttered, flicking a cigarette butt into the dust of the passing refugees. The order had come down from 8th Army headquarters just hours before. The front line had disintegrated. The 6th ROK Division had essentially ceased to exist, evaporating under the weight of a Chinese assault that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. There was a massive gap in the UN line, a gaping wound through which the 118th Division was pouring like water through a broken dam. If they weren't stopped, they would flank the entire U.S. Corps and take Seoul within days. Someone had to plug the gap. Someone had to go into the Kapyong Valley, a natural funnel surrounded by steep, unforgiving hills, and hold the door shut. The Australians knew exactly what they were driving into. They weren't naive. As the trucks rattled over the potholes, moving deeper into the darkening valley, the sounds of the retreat faded, replaced by an ominous silence. The artillery had stopped. The birds had stopped. The only sound was the wind whistling through the scrub of the desolate Korean hills. They reached their designated positions just as the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, casting long, cold shadows across the valley floor. The location was Hill 504. It wasn't a fortress. It was just a rocky, scrub-covered knob of earth in the middle of nowhere. "All right, off the trucks," the sergeants barked. "Get your shovels. If you don't dig, you die." There was no speech about saving democracy. There was no flag waving. There was just the scraping of entrenching tools against the hard, unforgiving Korean earth. As the Australians dug their pits, creating the only defensive line between the Chinese army and the capital city, the sun finally set. And from the darkness to the north, for the first time, they heard it. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives.
It was the sound of 1,000 bugles, shrill and terrifying, echoing off the valley walls. The dragon was awake, and it was coming for them.
To understand the sheer scale of the horror that was about to descend upon the Kapyong Valley, you have to look at the map of the Korean peninsula on the morning of April 22, 1951. For months, the war had been a seesaw of momentum. The North Koreans had pushed south, the United Nations had pushed north to the Yalu River, and then the sleeping giant had awoken. The People's Republic of China, fearing an American presence on their border, had intervened with a force so massive it defied comprehension. This was the Fifth Phase Offensive, or as the soldiers on the ground would come to call it, the Spring Offensive. The statistics were staggering. Across the front, over 700,000 Chinese and North Korean troops were poised to strike. Their objective was not just to take territory, it was to annihilate the United Nations command. The order from Peng Dehuai, the commander of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, PVA, was explicit. Destroy the enemy, capture Seoul, drive the imperialists into the sea. It was to be the final, crushing blow of the war. Leading the spearhead of this colossal assault in the central sector was the Chinese 118th Division. These were not the terrified conscripts or poorly trained militia that Western propaganda often portrayed. The men of the 118th were hardened veterans. Many of them had spent the last decade fighting in the brutal Chinese Civil War. They had defeated the nationalists not with superior technology, but with superior discipline, stamina, and a tactical doctrine that was terrifyingly effective against Western armies. They were light infantry in the truest sense. They carried no heavy sleeping bags, no tents, no massive rucksacks. A Chinese soldier carried a rifle, a bandolier of ammunition, a bag of rice, and stick grenades, lots of stick grenades. They were ghosts. They moved almost exclusively at night to avoid American air power. During the day, they would vanish, camouflaging themselves so effectively that spotter planes would report empty hills, only for those same hills to erupt with 10,000 men once the sun went down. And on this night, the 118th Division had a single target, the Kapyong Valley. The valley was a strategic nightmare for the defenders. It was a natural funnel, a narrow corridor carved by the Pukhan River, surrounded by towering, steep ridgelines. Geographically, it was the back door to Seoul. The main highway to the capital ran right through it. If the Chinese could punch through Kapyong, they would split the UN forces in half, flank the US I Corps and 9 Corps, and roll their tanks straight into Seoul, which lay only 40 miles to the south. The capture of Seoul would be a political death blow to the UN mission. The only thing standing in the way of the 118th Division, a force of roughly 10,000 to 12,000 men, was the hastily assembled 27th British Commonwealth Brigade. And the tip of that spear, the unit digging into the critical high ground on the eastern side of the valley, was the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment. The math was suicidal. A single understrength battalion of roughly 600 Australians was about to catch the full weight of a division. But it wasn't just the numbers that kept the Allied commanders awake at night. It was the tactic the Chinese used to leverage those numbers. The West called it the human wave. The term human wave summons images of a mindless mob charging into machine gun fire like zombies. This is a dangerous misconception. The Chinese tactic was, in reality, a sophisticated, ruthless, and mathematically calculated method of assault, designed to break a technologically superior enemy. It wasn't a mob, it was a conveyor belt of death. The tactic, known doctrinally as the short attack, worked in 3 distinct, terrifying phases. Phase 1, the infiltration and the probe. The Chinese did not attack along a broad front. They probed for the seams between units.
They would send small, suicidal squads of grenadiers crawling through the scrub, inching their way up the slopes under the cover of darkness. Their job wasn't to survive, their job was to find where the machine guns were. They would get close, within 20 or 30 meters, and unleash a barrage of stick grenades to blow gaps in the barbed wire and trigger the defenders' fire. Phase 2, the wedge. Once the heavy weapons were located, the wave would begin. But it wasn't a line, it was a V formation, a wedge designed to crack the defensive line at its weakest point. The first wave carried submachine guns, the distinct rapid-fire burp guns, PPSH-41s, and bags of grenades. They rushed the breach. If they were cut down, the second wave was right behind them, literally stepping over the bodies of the first to pick up their weapons and continue the charge. And Phase 3, the collapse. This was the genius of the tactic. Western armies relied on firepower, artillery, air support, and heavy machine guns. But firepower consumes ammunition. The Chinese knew that a machine gun barrel would eventually overheat and melt. They knew that a soldier only carried a finite amount of ammunition. The human wave was designed to absorb the enemy's firepower until the guns went dry. They traded blood for bullets. When the defenders were frantically reloading, or when their barrels were glowing red-hot and jamming, the third wave would crash into the trenches. At that point, the technological advantage of the West vanished. The battle became a medieval melee of bayonets, trench knives, and entrenching tools. And orchestrating this nightmare was the sound. The Chinese army didn't rely on radios, which were scarce and unreliable in the interference of the mountains. They relied on music. As the sun fully set over Kapyong, the Australians heard the first notes. It started as a low, mournful wail, echoing off the canyon walls, a shepherd's flute. Then came the whistles, sharp, piercing blasts that signaled unit movements. And finally, the bugles, the brassy, discordant blare of Chinese bugles signaling the charge. To the men of 3 RAR, dug into the rocky soil of Hill 504, it sounded like a carnival from hell. The noise was psychological warfare. It was designed to terrify, to disorient, and to announce the inevitability of what was coming. It told them, "We are here, we are everywhere, and there are more of us than you have bullets." The dragon wasn't just a metaphor. It was a living, breathing entity made of 10,000 men, moving with a singular purpose in the dark. It had already swallowed the South Korean 6th Division whole, spitting out the survivors in a panicked rout. Now it turned its gaze towards the Australians. The valley floor was already swarming. The Chinese had bypassed the forward outposts and were wading across the shallow Pukon River, icy water up to their waists, holding their rifles above their heads. They were moving to encircle the Australians, to cut them off from the road, from supplies, and from hope. Up on the hill, the Australian section commanders walked the lines, checking the Bren guns, ensuring the grenades were primed. They listened to the bugles getting closer. They didn't have night vision. They didn't have air support. The jets couldn't fly in the dark. All they had was the cold comfort of the high ground and the man standing next to them. The dragon had awoken, and it was hungry. The Battle of Kapyong was about to begin.
To understand why the Chinese offensive, a force of nature that had swept aside entire divisions of the South Korean and American armies, broke against Hill 504 like water against a rock, you have to look at the men holding the shovels. The United Nations force in Korea was a patchwork of nations, but in 1951 there was a distinct difference in the quality of the infantry. The American Army, having demobilized rapidly after World War II, was largely composed of young conscripts. These were teenagers from Kansas, New York, and California, drafted into a police action they barely understood, led by officers who were often green and inexperienced in the chaos of large-scale maneuver warfare. They were brave, certainly,
but they were young. When the bugles blew and the human waves came, panic was a natural, contagious reaction for men who had never seen the elephant. The 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3R, was different. They were known as the old breed. They were an all-volunteer force, and looking into the faces of the sergeants and warrant officers of 3R was like looking into a living history of the British Empire's wars. These weren't 19-year-olds on their first adventure away from home. These were hard, leather-skinned men in their late 20s and 30s. They possessed the 1,000-yard stare, that detached, hollow look of men who had seen too much death to be impressed by it. A significant number of the NCOs and officers on Hill 504 that evening wore ribbons on their chests that told a terrifying story. They were the Rats of Tobruk, the men who had held the vital port of Tobruk in North Africa against the Afrika Korps of Erwin Rommel in 1941. They had endured months of siege, Stuka dive bombers, and panzer assaults in the scorching desert, earning the grudging respect of the Germans. Others were veterans of the Pacific Theater. They had fought the Imperial Japanese Army on the Kokoda Track in New Guinea, a hellish, vertical jungle where the enemy didn't surrender and the environment tried to kill you as actively as the bullets did. They knew what it was like to fight an enemy that regarded death as an honor. They knew how to fight in the dark, in the mud, and in close quarters with bayonets and machetes. So when the Chinese army swarmed down the valley, screaming and blowing bugles, trying to invoke sheer terror, the reaction of the Australians wasn't panic. It was a cynical, professional scorn. They had seen Rommel's tanks. They had seen Japanese banzai charges. A few bugles weren't going to make them run. But their experience gave them more than just psychological armor. It gave them a tactical obsession that saved their lives. It gave them the shovel. The nickname Digger is one of the most famous monikers in military history. Originally dating back to the Gold Rush era and the trenches of Gallipoli in World War I, by 1951 it had become a philosophy of survival. The American doctrine of war was built on mobility and firepower. If you were attacked, you called in the Air Force, you mounted up in your trucks and half-tracks, and you maneuvered. The Australian doctrine was simpler, uglier, and infinitely more effective in a defensive hold. You dig. Dig deep or die. That was the mantra. While the retreating Allied forces were abandoning their equipment and streaming south on the roads, the men of 3R were doing the back-breaking work of turning Hill 504 into a fortress. But Hill 504 wasn't soft earth. It was a jagged, steep spine of rock and shale rising over 500 meters above the valley floor. It was covered in scrubby pine and thorny bushes. Digging here was agony. Entrenching tools sparked against granite, pickaxes blunted on the shale. Yet nobody complained. The veterans kicked the younger soldiers awake if they stopped digging. They knew that when the sun went down, the only thing that would separate a living man from a dead one is how much dirt he could put between himself and a Chinese burp gun. They didn't just dig foxholes, they built fighting pits. They cleared fields of fire, cutting down the scrub in front of their positions so the enemy would have no cover. They sighted their Bren light machine guns in interlocking arcs, ensuring that if the enemy attacked one pit, they would be exposed to fire from two others. They positioned the Vickers heavy machine guns to sweep the likely approaches. It was a masterclass in defensive engineering, executed in a few frantic hours by men who treated the shovel as much reverence as the rifle. By late afternoon, the battalion was set. They were deployed in a series of company positions stretched across the ridgelines. A Company held the center. B Company was pushed forward on a small knoll near the river. D Company held the summit. C Company was in reserve. It wasn't a continuous line. There weren't enough men for that. It was a series of islands, isolated strong points in a sea of dark, rugged terrain. Between the companies were gaps of hundreds of meters, gaps the Chinese would inevitably find and exploit. As the sun began to dip below the western peaks, casting the valley into a bruised purple twilight, the digging stopped. The valley floor below was eerily quiet, but the road was empty now. The refugees had gone. The retreating ROK army had gone. The dust had settled. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, the battalion commander, walked the lines. He didn't need to give a speech. He knew his men. He saw them cleaning their bolt-action Lee Enfield No. 1 Mark IIIs, ancient rifles by modern standards, but accurate and reliable in the bitter cold. He saw them laying out their grenades, the Mills bombs, on the lip of their trenches. He saw them opening cans of sea rations, eating cold stew with dirty fingers, their eyes scanning the northern approaches. They were the rear guard. They were the cork in the bottle. They knew that behind them lay the open road to Seoul, and ahead of them lay an entire Chinese division. A young private, perhaps experiencing his first moment of true dread, looked at his sergeant, a man with a face like leather who had fought at El Alamein. "Sarge," the private whispered, gesturing to the silent, darkening hills to the north, "how many of them do you reckon there are?" The sergeant didn't look up from oiling the bolt of his rifle. He took a drag of his roll-your-own cigarette, the cherry glowing in the dusk. "Doesn't matter, son. There's more of them than us, but they have to come up the hill, and we're the ones with the high ground." The old breed settled into their pits. They wrapped themselves in their greatcoats against the dropping temperature. They watched the shadows lengthen, and then they waited for the dragon to climb the hill.
The Night of the Bugles, Section 1. The sun died over the Kapyong Valley like a bruised fruit, bleeding purple and gray into the ridgelines before plunging the world into absolute blackness. For the men of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, the darkness was not a comfort, it was a blindfold. In the hills of Korea, night didn't just mean the end of the day, it meant the beginning of the war. The Chinese army owned the night. They didn't have radios to coordinate air support, and they didn't have tanks to rumble down the roads. They had legs, they had lungs, and they had the cover of darkness. At 2000 hours, the order came down the line, "Stand to." Every man in the battalion moved to his pit. There was no talking. The only sounds were the subtle, metallic clicks of safety catches being tested, and the rustle of greatcoats against the freezing dirt. The temperature plummeted, a sharp reminder that while spring might be on the calendar, the Korean wind still carried the bite of winter. In the forward pits of B Company, located on a small knoll near the river, the men ate their evening meal in silence. It was bully beef, cold, congealed corned beef from a tin, eaten with a spoon or a bayonet. It tasted like grease and salt, but it was calories. They ate it without looking at the tin, their eyes fixed on the black void to the north. They were the bait. They were the speed bump designed to slow the Chinese advance before it hit the main defensive line on Hill 504. A young private wiped the grease from his mouth and gripped the cold wood of his Lee Enfield rifle. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind, "it's too quiet." The sergeant, a veteran of the Kokoda track, didn't answer immediately. He was listening to something else. The silence of the valley wasn't empty. It was heavy. It felt pressurized, like the air before a thunderstorm. "Don't worry about the quiet, son. Worry about when it stops." And then, at 21:30, it stopped. It didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with a sound that was so alien, so discordant, that for a split second, the Australians didn't process it as a threat. It was a wail, a high-pitched, mournful note that drifted down from the mountains like a ghost. A shepherd's flute. Then came the cymbals, clash, 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 and finally, the bugles. The sound tore through the silence of the valley, a shrill, brassy scream that echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying until it sounded like 1,000 demons were announcing their arrival. It was a psychological sledgehammer. To the Americans down the road, it was the sound of terror. To the Australians, it was the dinner bell. "Here they come," a section commander roared. "Wait for it! Wait for it!" Then the whistles blew, sharp, piercing blasts that cut through the bugle calls. These were the officers' commands. In the darkness below B Company's position, the scrub began to move. Thump, thump, thump. 3 parachute flares fired by the Australian mortar platoon popped overhead. They drifted down on tiny silk chutes, burning with a blinding magnesium-white light. The shadows on the valley floor were instantly banished, replaced by a flickering, stark illumination that revealed the nightmare. The valley floor was moving. It wasn't a patrol, it wasn't a company. It was a sea of padded cotton uniforms. Thousands of Chinese soldiers were wading across the Pukon River, their rifles held high above the freezing water. They were moving not in a run, but in a steady, relentless trot. The sheer scale of it was paralyzing. It looked like the earth itself had opened up to vomit forth an army. "Open fire!" The order broke the spell. The forward pits of B Company erupted. The Bren light machine guns, mounted on their bipods, chattered into life, spitting tracers that slashed through the darkness like angry red hornets. The heavy Vickers machine guns, positioned further back to provide interlocking fields of fire, opened up with their rhythmic, chugging thud. The effect was devastating. The first wave of Chinese soldiers caught in the open water of the river was cut to pieces. The water turned frothy with bullet impacts and blood. But they didn't stop. They didn't take cover. They simply stepped over the bodies of the fallen and kept coming. This was the human wave in its most terrifying reality. It wasn't a tactic of mindless suicide. It was a tactic of mathematical attrition. The Chinese commanders knew exactly how many men they would lose to cross that river. They had done the calculus. They were spending lives to buy yards. Up on the knoll, the Australian gunners were screaming to be heard over the roar of their own weapons. "Change barrels," a number 2 shouted as he grabbed the spare barrel for the Bren gun. The barrel in use was glowing a dull cherry red in the dark, hot enough to melt the rifling if they didn't swap it out. They performed the drill in seconds, hands moving with practiced efficiency, ignoring the burns, snapping the fresh barrel in and resuming fire. But the Chinese were getting closer. The whistles blew again, and the wave shifted. They weren't just coming from the front anymore. They were flowing around the flanks. Grenadiers, crawling on their bellies through the tall grass, began to hurl potato masher grenades into the Australian pits. The explosions were deafening, sending showers of dirt and shrapnel into the air. Dust and smoke choked the air, mixing with the smell of cordite and the coppery tang of blood. The flares overhead sputtered and died, plunging the battlefield back into darkness, only for the muzzle flashes to strobe like a disco in hell. In those brief flashes of light, the Australians saw the enemy faces, young, determined, and terrifyingly close. They were no longer targets at 200 yards. They were shapes in the dark at 20 yards. The Lee Enfield rifles, famous for their mad-minute rate of fire, were being worked so hard the bolts were hot to the touch. Bang, click, clack, bang. Every shot dropped a man, but there was always 2 more behind him. "They're in the wire," a corporal yelled into his radio handset. "I repeat, they are in the wire." The defensive perimeter of B Company was beginning to buckle under the sheer weight of the assault. The old breed held their ground, firing until their magazines were empty, then reloading with trembling hands. But the bugles were getting louder. The enemy was no longer crossing the river. They were at the base of the hill, and they were climbing.
The Night of the Bugles, Section 2. Physics is a cruel mistress in war. A Bren light machine gun is a masterpiece of engineering, capable of spitting out .303 rounds at 500 rounds per minute. But metal has a melting point. As the Chinese wave crashed against the forward slope of the Australian position, the barrels of the Bren guns weren't just hot, they were white. The oil on the receivers was smoking, boiling off in acrid clouds that stung the eyes of the gunners. "Change the barrel," a number 2 screamed, grabbing the spare with an asbestos glove that was already beginning to smolder. But there was no time. The Chinese were no longer at 50 meters. They were at 5. The tactical battle, the exchange of fire and maneuver, ceased to exist. In the dark, cramped foxholes of B Company, the war devolved into something primal. It was no longer a contest of soldiers. It was a knife fight in a phone booth. When the machine guns finally jammed or ran dry, the silence that followed was terrifyingly brief, filled instantly by the scream of burp guns, the PPSH-41 submachine guns carried by the Chinese shock troops. The distinct burp-burp sound tore through the night air. This was the moment the old breed showed their true nature. A lesser unit might have broken. A unit of conscripts might have curled up in the bottom of their pits and waited for the end. But the Australians did something else. They stopped being riflemen and became brawlers. "Fix bayonets!" The order was roared down the line, though most men had already done it. The long 17-inch sword bayonets of the Lee Enfields clicked onto the muzzles with a sinister finality. Then the shadows jumped into the pits. The fighting that occurred in those trenches at 2300 hours is hard to describe in military terms because it wasn't military, it was butchery. There was no room to swing a rifle. Men grappled in the dirt, rolling over spent casings and empty ration tins. An Australian corporal, his rifle knocked from his hands, grabbed the only thing he had left, his entrenching tool. The 1937 pattern shovel was small, heavy, and possessed a sharpened steel edge for cutting through roots. In the hands of a desperate man, it was a medieval axe. He swung it with a grunt of exertion, the metal edge catching a Chinese soldier in the neck with a wet, sickening thud. There was no technique, no glory, just the frantic, sweaty desperation of men trying to kill the person on top of them before they were killed themselves. Nearby, the distinct thud-thud-thud of the Owen submachine gun joined the chorus. The Owen was an ugly weapon, a piece of plumbing pipe painted green with a magazine sticking out the top like a sore thumb. But in the mud and the blood of Kapyong, it was the best weapon on earth. It didn't jam. It didn't care about dirt. An Australian sergeant stood on the parapet of his trench, firing his Owen from the hip into the mass of gray shapes rushing up the hill, cutting them down like a scythe through wheat until the magazine clicked dry. He didn't reload. He reversed the weapon, holding it by the hot barrel, and used the heavy steel stock as a club to smash the face of the next man who tried to climb over the sandbags. The confusion was absolute. In the dark, uniforms were meaningless. The only way to tell friend from foe was by silhouette, the round helmet of the Australians versus the soft peaked cap of the Chinese, or by smell. The Australians smelled of damp wool and tobacco. The Chinese smelled of garlic and unwashed cotton. Grenade! A stick grenade landed in a pit occupied by two privates. There was no time to throw it back. One of them kicked it into the sump, the small drainage hole dug at the bottom of the trench, and threw himself against the wall. The explosion was muffled, a dull crump that shook the earth and showered them with dirt, but the shrapnel was contained. Their ears ringing, blood trickling from their noses from the concussion, they stood up and kept firing. They were fighting for inches. They were fighting for the man next to them, but the mathematics of the human wave were unrelenting. For every Chinese soldier they killed with a bayonet or a shovel, two more appeared out of the darkness. The sheer weight of numbers was beginning to tell. The defensive perimeter of B Company was shrinking like a deflating lung. The Chinese had infiltrated the gaps between the platoons. They were now behind the forward pits. The Australians were effectively surrounded, fighting back-to-back in a tightening circle. The radio operator for B Company, huddled in the command post, with the handset pressed to his ear, was shouting to be heard over the screams of the dying and the roar of the grenades. "Sunray! Sunray! This is Bravo 29er. They are all over us. We are combat ineffective. Repeat, we are combat ineffective." Battalion headquarters, a mile back on the main ridge, listened in horror. The map in the command tent showed B Company as a tiny blue circle drowning in a sea of red arrows. The dragon had swallowed the outpost. But B Company hadn't surrendered.
As the ammunition ran out, the order was quietly passed among the survivors. It wasn't an order to flee, it was an order to withdraw to the secondary positions. But you don't turn your back on a tiger. They would have to walk backwards, firing their last rounds, stabbing at the shadows that grabbed at their legs. As they prepared to abandon their forward pits, leaving behind the dead they couldn't carry, a new sound cut through the chaos. It wasn't a bugle, it was the roar of a jet engine. But it wasn't the salvation they had prayed for. It was a mistake, a tragic, horrifying mistake that was about to turn a desperate situation into a catastrophe. High above, lost in the dark and the confusion of a fluid battlefield, a flight of American aircraft was lining up on the wrong coordinates.
War is chaos wrapped in confusion, and in the pitch black of the Kapyong Valley, the fog of war was about to become literal, toxic, and terrifyingly hot. By 1 a.m., the situation for B Company was critical. They had been fighting hand-to-hand for over 2 hours. Their ammunition was critically low. The Chinese waves had crashed over their forward pits and were now seeping into the main defensive perimeter like water through a cracked dam. The only thing keeping them alive was the desperate, rhythmic thud of their own Vickers machine guns and the sheer stubborn refusal of the Australian infantrymen to yield ground. Then the radio crackled with a voice that should have brought hope. It was the Forward Air Controller, FAC, circling high above in a mosquito-like spotter plane, guiding a flight of U.S. Marine Corps F-4U Corsairs that had been scrambled from a carrier off the coast. Baker 6, this is Cowboy 2-1. We have eyes on the target area, rolling in hot. The exhausted Australians looked up. The distinctive throaty roar of the radial engines was usually the sound of salvation. The Corsair was a beast of a plane, capable of carrying a massive payload of ordnance. But in the dark, with the lines blurring and the tracer fire crisscrossing in a confused spiderweb, the target area was a dangerously ambiguous term. The pilots were flying on instruments and adrenaline. They were looking down into a black void punctuated by flashes. They saw movement. They saw muzzle flashes. But from 5,000 feet, they couldn't see the slouch hats. They couldn't see the desperate hand signals. They just saw a concentration of troops on a hilltop that their maps said was overrun. The first Corsair dove. The sound of a plane in a dive is a physical sensation, a screaming crescendo that vibrates in your chest. The Australians on the ridge braced themselves, expecting the bombs to fall on the Chinese massing in the valley below. Instead, the world turned orange. A canister of napalm, jellied gasoline, tumbled from the wing of the lead aircraft. It didn't hit the enemy. It hit the forward edge of the B Company position. The explosion was a silent, expanding blossom of hell. For a split second, the night vanished, replaced by a blinding, searing daylight. Then came the heat. A wave of thermal energy so intense it singed eyebrows at 50 meters and sucked the oxygen out of the lungs of anyone closer. The gel splashed across the rocky ground, clinging to everything it touched: scrub, rock, uniforms, flesh, and burning with a fury that water could not extinguish. "Check fire! Check fire! For God's sakes, check fire!" The radio operator was screaming into the handset, his voice cracking with panic and rage. But it was too late. The second Corsair was already in its dive, dropping high explosive fragmentation bombs into the inferno. The ground heaved. Men were thrown into the air like rag dolls. The shockwave collapsed trenches, burying the defenders alive in their own sanctuary. The psychological impact was devastating. To be killed by the enemy is a soldier's risk. To be killed by your own side is a betrayal of the universe. For a moment, the firing stopped. Both sides, the Chinese and the Australians, seemed stunned by the violence of the airstrike.
The silence that followed was only filled with the crackling of burning brush and the screams of the wounded. In that silence, something broke inside the men of B Company, but it wasn't their spirit, it was their restraint. A young private, his face blackened by soot, pulled himself out of the dirt. He looked at the burning crater where his mate's foxhole used to be. He didn't cry, he didn't run. He picked up his rifle, worked the bolt with a savage, mechanical jerk, and spat a glob of bloody phlegm into the fire. "Right, is that all you bastards have got?" The friendly fire incident didn't break them, it solidified them. It stripped away the last vestiges of hope for rescue. They realized, with a cold, crystal clarity, that no one was coming to save them. The cavalry had arrived, and it had just bombed them. They were alone, completely, utterly alone on a frozen hill in Korea, surrounded by thousands of enemy soldiers, abandoned by luck and betrayed by circumstance. And that made them dangerous. This is a phenomenon known to combat psychologists as fighting angry. When fear is replaced by rage, a soldier becomes a terrifying instrument. The hesitation vanishes, the concern for personal safety evaporates. The only thing left is a pure, distilled desire to inflict pain on anything that moves. "Fix bayonets!" The order wasn't shouted at this time, it was passed down the line in a hiss. The Australians rose from their pits. They weren't waiting for the next wave anymore, they were welcoming it. When the Chinese bugles blew again, signaling the resumption of the attack, the Australians didn't hunker down, they stood up on the parapets. "Come on," a sergeant roared, brandishing a shovel like a battle axe. "Come and get it, you sons of bitches!" The Chinese charged, sensing weakness after the airstrike. They expected to find a demoralized, shattered enemy. Instead, they ran into a buzzsaw. The fighting that ensued was the most savage of the entire night. The Australians fought with a ferocity that shocked the Chinese attackers. They used their rifles as clubs. They used rocks. They used their fists. A Bren gunner, his weapon jammed, stood up and threw the searing hot gun into the face of a charging enemy soldier before drawing his knife. They fought not for the United Nations. They fought not for Seoul. They fought not for democracy or freedom or any of the abstract concepts politicians speak of. They fought for the man next to them who was currently burning. They fought because they were angry. The B Company perimeter was held. It is held by the skin of its teeth, fueled by rage and adrenaline. The Chinese wave broke against this wall of fury, faltered, and rolled back down the hill, leaving piles of dead in the wire. But the respite was temporary. As the adrenaline faded, the reality set in. They were out of ammunition, they were cut off, and the sun was still hours away. The radio operator looked at the company commander, his face a mask of exhaustion. "Sir," he said quietly, "the battalion says we have to hold. There's no one behind us." The commander looked at his men, bleeding, burnt, bandaged with dirty rags, their eyes burning with that terrible cold anger. He nodded. "Tell them," he said, "that we're not going anywhere. We're diggers. We stay."
By 04 hours, the concept of a front line had ceased to exist. The battlefield at Kapyong had devolved into a confused, swirling melee. The Chinese 118th Division had done exactly what they were trained to do. They had flowed like water through the cracks in the dam. They had infiltrated the gaps between the Australian companies, bypassed the forward pits, and were now swarming up the re-entrant gullies towards the battalion headquarters. For the men of B Company, still clinging to their isolated knoll, the situation was terminal. They were no longer fighting a defensive battle. They were fighting a siege. The Chinese were inside the wire. They were on the parapets. The fighting was so close that Australian soldiers were using the heavy brass bases of their spent artillery shells as clubs.
The perimeter had shrunk to a radius of less than 50 meters. Major O'Dowd, checking the lines of A Company, realized the grim mathematics of the sunrise. When the light came, the Chinese would see exactly how few defenders were left. They would bring up their heavy mortars. They would mass for one final, overwhelming rush, and the Australians would be wiped out to a man. There was only one card left to play. It was a card that no commander ever wants to play, a desperate gamble that required an insane level of trust between the infantry on the hill and the gunners miles away in the valley. It was the broken arrow of the Korean War. The radio operator in the forward observation post keyed his handset. His voice was calm, terrifyingly so, amidst the backdrop of screaming men and exploding grenades. He was speaking to the 16th Field Regiment of the Royal New Zealand Artillery, the Kiwis. The bond between the Aussies and the Kiwis is forged in blood, dating back to the cliffs of Gallipoli. They were cousins, rivals, and brothers. And on this freezing night, the New Zealand gunners were the only thing standing between the Australians and annihilation. "Target my position," the forward observer whispered into the radio. "Repeat, target my position. Drop it on my head." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The New Zealand battery commander checked the coordinates. They matched the Australian defensive grid exactly. "Confirm," the Kiwi voice crackled back, tight with tension. "You want it on you? They are in the trenches with us, mate. Drop it, now." "Shot one," the Kiwi replied. Miles away in the rear, the New Zealand gun crews were working like men possessed. They were stripped to the waist despite the freezing cold, sweat steaming off their bodies in the night air. The 25-pounder field guns were their instruments, and they played them with a virtuoso's precision. They cranked the elevation handles, lowering the barrels until they were firing almost flat. "Fire!" The first round screamed out of the tube. On the hill, the Australians heard it coming. It wasn't the whistle of a mortar or the crack of a bullet. It was the sound of a tearing canvas sheet, the distinct ripping noise of incoming heavy artillery. "Get down!" the sergeants roared. "Get deep!" This was the moment where the digger philosophy paid its ultimate dividend. For hours, the Australians had been mocked for their obsession with digging. They had hacked into the rocky soil until their hands bled, creating narrow, deep, L-shaped fighting pits. Now, those pits were the only things that mattered in the universe. The Australians curled into balls at the bottom of their holes, pressing their helmets into the dirt, opening their mouths to equalize the pressure. The shell landed. The earth didn't just shake, it convulsed. The 25-pounder shell is a terrifying weapon, designed to shatter into thousands of razor-sharp steel fragments that travel at supersonic speeds. But here was the physics of survival. Shrapnel travels up and out in a cone. The Chinese soldiers were exposed. They were running across the open ground, climbing over the parapets, standing up to throw grenades. They were above the ground. The Australians were below it. The first shell was followed by another, then 4 more. Then the entire battery opened up. It was a regimental fire mission, every gun available pouring fire onto a single grid square. The summit of the hill disappeared. It became a churning volcano of fire, dirt, and steel. To an observer from a distance, it looked like the Australians were being obliterated. The explosions walked back and forth across the position, churning the earth like a farmer's plow. Inside the pits, the noise was beyond deafening. It was a physical weight that pressed against the chest. Dust poured down on the huddled men, burying them alive. The ground hammered against their ribs. They were being bounced around like dice in a cup. They screamed, but they couldn't hear themselves. They prayed to a god they hadn't spoken to in years. But above them, the dragon was being slain. The Chinese attack was disintegrated. The sheer violence of the barrage caught the 118th Division completely off guard. They had expected the Australians to wither. They had expected the artillery to try and block their supply lines. They never expected the enemy to call down the apocalypse on their own heads. The shrapnel scythed through the Chinese ranks. There was no cover for them. The trees were shredded into toothpicks. The rocks were pulverized. The human wave, which had relied on momentum and terror, was suddenly confronted with a wall of impassable fire. For 10 minutes, the Kiwis hammered the hill. They fired until the paint blistered on their gun barrels. They fired until their arms ached from loading. And they fired with a virtuoso's precision. They were dropping shells within 20 meters of the Australian positions, a margin of error so slim that a single miscalculation, a single breath of wind, would have wiped out their own allies. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the guns stopped. The silence that returned to the Kapyong Valley was heavier than before. It was a ringing, concussed silence. The smoke hung low over the hill, thick and acrid, smelling of corderite and pulverized stone. Slowly, tentatively, the mounds of dirt in the Australian foxholes began to move. A hand emerged, then a helmet, then a pair of eyes, wide and white with shock, blinking through a mask of dust. An Australian corporal pushed the dirt off his shoulders and stood up. He coughed, spitting out grit. He looked around. The landscape had changed. The scrub was gone. The trees were gone. The ground was a moonscape of craters. And lying everywhere, covering the ground like a carpet of gray rags, were the bodies of the enemy. The Chinese who had survived were stunned, wandering dazed or retreating back down the slope in disorder. The momentum of the assault was broken. The human wave had crashed against the rocks of the 3rd Battalion and had been evaporated by the fire of the New Zealanders. The radio operator in the command post shook the dirt off his handset. He keyed the mic, his hand trembling uncontrollably. "Kiwi, this is Sunray," he croaked, his voice dry as sandpaper. "Go ahead, Sunray. Status." The New Zealand voice came back, anxious. The operator looked at the survivors of his platoon, who were checking their limbs, realizing they were still alive, realizing they had held the line. "Target effective," the operator whispered. "Thanks, mate. You saved our bacon." They had survived the night. They had called the lightning down on themselves and walked away from the scorched earth. But as the gray light of dawn finally began to bleed over the eastern peaks, revealing the true horror of the carnage around them, the Australians knew the battle wasn't over. They had held the hill, but they were still surrounded, and now they had to get out.
The sun that finally rose over the Kapyong Valley on the morning of April 24, 1951, illuminated a scene that looked less like a battlefield and more like the surface of a dead planet. The lush green scrub that had covered Hill 504 just 24 hours earlier was gone, replaced by churned earth, splintered trees, and the grotesque debris of war. But the light brought clarity to the grim reality of the 3rd Battalion situation. They had held the line. They had broken the spine of the Chinese 118th Division's assault. The human waves had crashed against them and shattered. But the cost of that victory was encirclement. The Chinese, though mauled, were still moving around their flanks, cutting off the road to the rear. The Australians were an island in a hostile sea. The order came down from brigade headquarters: withdraw. To a civilian, withdraw sounds like defeat. It sounds like running away. But in military terms, a withdrawal under contact is the most difficult and dangerous maneuver an army can perform. It requires nerves of steel. If one man panics, if one unit breaks and runs, the entire formation collapses into a rout. The Australians didn't run. They didn't panic. They executed a textbook fighting withdrawal, a maneuver as precise and disciplined as a ballet performed in a minefield. It began with the wounded. The walking wounded helped the stretcher cases. Men with shrapnel in their legs hobbled down the reverse slopes, supported by their mates. They moved through the pre-dawn mist, silent ghosts leaving the scene of a nightmare. Then came the main body. They used a tactic known as leapfrogging or bounding overwatch.
One section would stay behind, laying down a furious wall of covering fire to keep the Chinese heads down. While the enemy was suppressed, the rest of the platoon would peel back, sprinting to the next piece of cover, a rock, a defilade, a bend in the trail. Once they were set, they would open fire, allowing the rearguard section to disengage and sprint past them to the next position. It was a slow, agonizing dance. Move, fire, cover, move, fire, cover. The Chinese, realizing their prey was slipping away, tried to press the advantage. They launched probing attacks at the retreating columns, desperate to turn the withdrawal into a slaughter. But every time they surged forward, they were met with a disciplined volley of rifle fire that withered their ranks. The Australians weren't fleeing. They were backing away like a cornered wolf, snapping its jaws at anything that got too close. The rearguard actions were where the true heroism of the morning unfolded. Small groups of men, sometimes just a corporal and 2 privates with a Bren gun, volunteered to stay behind to hold the line for 5 more minutes. Those 5 minutes bought the rest of the company the time they needed to cross the open ground. One such group, manning a rearguard position on a rocky outcrop, fired until their barrels were warped from the heat. They watched their comrades disappear down the valley, knowing that every minute they stayed increased the likelihood that they would never leave. When the Chinese finally overran their position, they found empty casings and defiant men who fought to the last bullet. Their sacrifice was the currency that purchased the battalion's survival. By mid-morning, the main body of 3 RAR had cleared the valley floor and linked up with the tanks of the U.S. 72nd Heavy Tank Battalion. The sight of the American Shermans rumbling up the road was the first sign that they had made it. But the tankers, looking out of their hatches, were shocked by what they saw walking towards them. The men of the 3rd Battalion didn't look like soldiers anymore. They looked like creatures dredged from the bottom of hell. They had been fighting for over 24 hours straight without sleep. Their uniforms were shredded, hanging off their frames in tatters. They were covered in a thick layer of gray dust from the artillery barrage, which had mixed with sweat and blood to form a caked mask on their faces. Their eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, staring out from blackened sockets. Some were supporting wounded comrades, others were carrying the weapons of the dead. They walked with a heavy, shuffling gait, the zombie walk of total exhaustion. They didn't cheer when they saw the tanks. They didn't wave. They just kept walking, one foot in front of the other, moving towards the rear assembly area. An American officer, watching the column pass, reportedly took off his helmet in a gesture of silent respect. He had seen units break before. He had seen men throw away their rifles and run. But these men, they still had their rifles, they still had their wounded, and most terrifyingly, they still had their discipline. As they reached safety, the adrenaline finally crashed. Men simply collapsed where they stood, falling asleep before their bodies hit the ground. They slept in the ditches, on the hoods of jeeps, in the mud. The tension that had held them together like a wire finally snapped, leaving behind only a profound, bone-deep weariness. They had done the impossible. A single battalion of Australians, supported by a battery of New Zealand gunners and a company of Canadian infantry on a neighboring hill, had stopped an entire Chinese division cold. They had blunted the spearhead of the spring offensive. They had saved Seoul. But as they slept the sleep of the dead, the magnitude of what they had survived hadn't yet sunk in. They didn't know they had just fought one of the most significant battles of the 20th century. To them, it was just another job, just another hill, just another night where the only thing that mattered was holding the line.
The sun rose on April 25, 1951, Anzac Day, the most sacred day in the Australian military calendar, to find the men of 3 RAR not on a parade ground, but exhausted, bloodied, and scattered in the rear echelon. They had just fought a battle that would rival the very legend they were supposed to be commemorating.
The Chinese 118th Division had been stopped. The dragon that was poised to swallow Seoul had broken its teeth on a single, stubborn battalion of Australians and a company of Canadians on the adjacent hill 677. The delay caused by the stand at Kapyong allowed the United Nations forces to regroup, establish a new defensive line north of Seoul, and prevent the capital from falling. The Chinese spring offensive, which had begun with such terrifying momentum, stalled and eventually collapsed. The significance of this action cannot be overstated. Had Kapyong fallen quickly, the road to Seoul would have been wide open. The political and psychological blow of losing the capital again might have forced the UN to abandon the peninsula entirely. The history of modern Asia was quite literally decided in those dark, freezing hills by a few hundred men with shovels and Lee-Enfield rifles. Recognition came, but it was from an unexpected source. The United States, whose own forces had crumbled during the initial Chinese onslaught, awarded the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment the Presidential Unit Citation. It is an incredibly rare honor for a foreign unit to receive. The citation reads, in part, "The 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment are cited for extraordinary heroism and outstanding performance of combat duties. Exposed to the full fury of the enemy assault, the Australians held their ground with resolute determination." Yet, despite this high praise, the Battle of Kapyong remains curiously absent from the popular consciousness. When Australians think of military history, they think of the cliffs of Gallipoli, the trenches of the Somme, the jungle of Kokoda, or the rubber plantation of Long Tan. Kapyong is often a footnote. Why? Perhaps because the Korean War itself is the forgotten war. It ended not in victory, but in a stalemate that continues to this day. There were no ticker-tape parades for the returning veterans. There were no movies made about their stand. They came home to a world that had already moved on, a world more interested in the booming economy of the 1950s than the frozen hell of a peninsula halfway around the world. But for the men who were there, the legacy of Kapyong is not about medals or citations. It is about a specific kind of brotherhood forged in the crucible of absolute desperation. It is about the memory of a night when the bugles blew and the world tried to kill them, and they simply refused to die. They proved that the digger spirit wasn't just a myth from World War I. It was alive and well. It was the ability to dig in when others ran. It was the ability to crack a joke when the situation was hopeless. It was the ability to call artillery down on your own head rather than surrender an inch of ground. Today, if you visit the valley of Kapyong, it is peaceful. The scars of the artillery have healed over with new growth, but there is a memorial there. It lists the names of the 32 Australians who died that night. It stands as a silent sentinel to a battle that saved a nation.